What I'm going to be talking about in this next hour, roughly this next hour, is how community fire destruction occurs during extreme wildfires, and then with that define the problem of community destruction, particularly disastrous community destruction, numerous homes destroyed, being a home ignition problem. So this is the kind of scene that I class as a disastrous event. It's, I mean, with the recognition that anybody's house that burns is going to be a disaster. So what I'm looking at is essentially the large disasters, the multiple disastrous community destruction. And I call that the wildland-urban fire disaster, the many homes and businesses that burn to total destruction. So in order to effectively manage wildland fire and to prevent wildland-urban fire disasters, what I want you to understand is that there is more to the wildland fire context than just homes burning during the wildfire. We need to look at wildfire occurrence, wildland fire occurrence, as both a natural disturbance, an appropriate ecological process, and as a natural hazard. We tend to focus on the natural hazard because it initiates community burning, and we tend not to know about or ignore fire as an appropriate ecological occurrence. So let's take a look at fire as an ecological occurrence. So the first premise is wildland fire occurrence is inevitable, whether it's from lightning or whether it's from human cause, it's inevitable. We also need to recognize that North American ecosystems, with very few exceptions, developed with and were maintained by fire, ignited mostly by humans as well as lightning. And this has been going on since humans were here and in various parts of the country when the climate changed from having ice caps where I live here in Montana, as well as the climate changing all the way through North America. So as that climate changed with humans here as well as lightning, there was fire in the development of these ecosystems as an ecological process, as a selective process. And because of the influence of humans lighting fires, our indigenous peoples, that means that human ignitions and humans are part of that natural development of these ecosystems. So one of the things that I want to emphasize here is not focusing on cause of the ignition, but rather the results of the ignition, the results of the fire that occurs from that ignition. Well, so our current occurrence of fire is considerably different than what it was before European settlement. So starting with disease depopulation and the subjugation of Native Americans on this continent, European settlement, along with agriculture, urban development, and over the last little over 100 years, modern attempts at fire exclusion, we have greatly reduced and changed the occurrence of wildland fire. So specifically over roughly the last 100 years, wildfire suppression has largely kept 98% of fires small and has largely eliminated the historical ecological occurrence of wildland fire and its influence. And a portion of that 2% of wildfires that escape initial attack become extreme under the most severe conditions, which is actually less than 1% of the occurrences. And what this has developed into, particularly our intense attempt at wildfire exclusion, we have inadvertently increased the potential for extreme wildfire conditions over extensive areas. And this is when wildland-urban fire disasters occur. It's these extreme wildfire conditions that are associated with the disastrous community destruction. So let's take a look at wildland fire now as a natural hazard, what we tend to focus on. So this has historically occurred, particularly in the US, in the continental US. So let's look at 1870 to 1990. Historians call this period the Great Barbecue, Steve Pine in particular. This is when mostly very large fires, very high influence on the societies that were living there. Interestingly enough, in 1871, the Peshtigo fire, burning over 1 million acres in the Lake States, primarily in Wisconsin, occurred on the very same day under the very same weather influences as the well-known Great Chicago Fire. And during this period, over 2,000 civilian fatalities occurred and numerous entire towns and villages were destroyed. Now, the interesting thing about this is we might hear, well, fire suppression didn't have anything to do with these huge fires in the Lake States and elsewhere. So what's this fire suppression thing? Well, but we need to recognize that in this particular case, there was a huge amount of slash and burn agriculture, as well as timber harvesting, the extraction of wood products that left an enormous amount of vegetative debris. And it was this debris that was over large areas of the Lake States that generated the high intensity fires. Well, between 1920 and 1984, we also, to a lesser extent, have the same kinds of events occurring. We had less than 100 civilian fatalities in this case. Over now, with the advent of fire suppression, 400 or more firefighter burnover fatalities, and 5,000, a little greater than 5,000 homes destroyed. So in 1985, this is a demarcation point in this issue, because it was in 1985, primarily the spring to fall of 1985, that 1,400 homes, little more than that, were destroyed primarily in Florida, North Carolina, and California. And it motivated the National Wildland-Urban Interface Initiative. It was an initiative of federal, state, and local agencies, and it generated programs such as FireWise, Fire Adapted Communities, and other programs. So let's take a look at what this national recognition has done to influence the disaster occurrence since 1985. Well, let's take a look at this isn't a complete list necessarily, but it is a list starting in 1990 up to roughly last year. So we can see that we have had many of the disasters of home destruction, between 999 homes destroyed. Interestingly enough, when we start looking at 1,000 or more homes destroyed, we can see that particularly with California and one other location in the Smoky Mountain, in the Appalachians, we have a significant increase in the number of homes destroyed during an event. And interestingly enough, when we look at 2018, which was primarily the Carr, Camp, and Woolsey fires, we see that the destruction of homes, this is homes, not just structures, 16,000 homes destroyed, when the national total for the 10 years between 1985 and 1994 was 9,000. Well, so the bottom line of my point here is that the national attention that started in 1985, that increased suppression resources and federal, state, and local collaborations, have not effectively abated the increasing trend of wildland-urban fire disasters. So what we've done with increased fire suppression capability is largely to continue the wildfire paradox. Our national focus on wildfire as a natural hazard, with suppression as the principal response, particularly for community protection, has continued fire largely not occurring as an appropriate ecological factor, particularly in the Western US, and communities largely are not becoming ignition resistant to extreme wildfire exposures, and hence we have increasing wildland-urban fire disasters. So this brings us to a puzzle, to a conundrum. How can we have appropriate wildland fire as an ecological factor without having wildland-urban fire disasters? So given that wildfires are inevitable, there is no trend in our history to indicate otherwise, and thus we're going to have extreme wildfires that are inevitable. Does this mean that wildland-urban fire disasters are inevitable? And my response to this is no. It is not inevitable to burn up our communities during wildfires. So given current best available science for understanding how homes ignite, wildland-urban fire destruction during an extreme wildfire is a readily preventable human disaster. So what I mean by that, I'm now calling it a human disaster, not a natural disaster. And the reason for that is because we have the ability to prevent the destruction, the human disaster, during the occurrence of wildfire as a hazard. And most importantly, we have the ability to take our communities out of being a problem for having wildland fire as an appropriate ecological occurrence. So fire science reveals opportunities for preventing wildland-urban fire disasters without necessarily controlling extreme wildfires, which we by and large can't do anyway. Well, so the notion of not necessarily having to control wildfire in order to prevent the wildland-urban fire disaster is not something I think we generally conceive of in our society. So the question is the ability to prevent wildland-urban fire disasters without controlling wildfires consistent with what we perceive as how wildland-urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's take a look at a few samples of media interviews to indicate what our perceptions are. The firestorm descended like a dragon from hell on the foothill neighborhoods and laid them to waste. The wildfire swept through the community with a tsunami of flame The wildfire literally exploded houses in flames, leaving destruction in its path. It was like a war zone. Well, so let's take a look at Paradise. So a few days after this scene was available via internet, I was getting questions principally from journalists to the tune of, can you explain the unusual pattern of destruction? It's interesting to me that it took drone footage, high definition drone images, in order for us to see what is typical of the pattern of destruction, which was my response to their question. We're looking at total home destruction without the tree canopies burning. So when we look at a scene like this, people see what they believe and ignore the rest. We see this as being the result of a tsunami of superheated gases that lays this whole community to waste. We see something from the outside coming in and victimizing without any ability to change the results. And we tend not to see the canopy, the green unconsumed canopy surrounding this destroyed community. The typical patterns of wildland-urban fire destruction do not support this perception of walls of flame sweeping through communities. And wildfires don't literally explode houses into flames. So when we look at a scene like this is from the Laguna fire in 1993, we see a lone house surviving without protection. There was no protection in here, primarily because of overwhelming exposure and burning of homes, and it was a severe life safety hazard. So this house became known as the Miracle House. But when we look at the scene, what else didn't burn in this community? And by the way, the wildland is way back at the top of this scene. Through the haze of smoke, that's where the chaparral, the Southern California chaparral was that supported the wildfire. Most of this picture, most of this image is suburban Laguna. So when we look at this scene as to what else didn't burn, we see, yeah, miracle vegetation. So these homes are burning without the participation of fire in the chaparral. These homes ignited from lofted burning embers, not from wildfire flames. Now, as it turns out, both of these homes were highly vulnerable to burning ember ignitions. They had flammable wood roofs. In this particular case, it wasn't flammable wood roofs. This is Los Alamos, more than a block inside the community. And by and large, what we're looking at here are burning embers igniting surface material, vegetation litter that contacted the house for destruction. And when we look at this scene, these two houses, they're side by side. They were contacted by low intensity surface fire that burned with low enough intensity. Notice the wood rail fence in the behind this home, and this burned from a surface fire, low intensity, making contact with the home several hours after the high intensity wildfire spread past the community, not to the community. Let's take a look and see what this looks like, this very block, what it looks like when it was burning. So here we are in Los Alamos, homes burning hours after the wildfire passed the community. Intense wildfire never spread to this residential area. And the houses are burning, and we're looking at that through unburned, not burning tree canopies. In this particular case, we're looking at low intensity surface fire spreading continuously to make contact with flammables on site sufficient to ignite the house sustainably. This is a different location. This is what it looks like. Typically, home ignitions result from lofted burning embers, from low intensity surface fire spreading to contact the structure, either ignited from the wildfire that never reaches this area, or due to lofted burning embers generating what we call spot fires that then can spread to the home, across roads, over other kinds of obstructions. So when we look at unconsumed tree canopies amid the total destruction of homes, this indicates that wildfire flames did not spread through the community. Burning trees did not ignite these homes, and the trees that were consumed adjacent to and over the destroyed homes, what is now the destroyed homes, ignited from the burning homes. We can take a look at Australia. This is the 2009 Melbourne fires. This is Kings Lake, and we see the same scene. Eucalyptus canopies, various species of eucalyptus, unconsumed, with total destruction of homes. Napa, 2017, the oaks in the background did not consume. The Carr Fire, 2018, burning embers ignited the home without any high intensity wildfire. And last year in 2020, the same kind of pattern, total destruction surrounded by unconsumed tree canopies. So commonly communities burned by fire spreading through residential fuels, the vegetation and structures within the community are spreading the fire. These homes, as well as all of the other disasters that I've dealt with, where 100 or more homes have been destroyed, ignited and burned hours after significant wildfire activity has ceased, either at the community edge or the wildfire got to the community, other than by burning embers. The community continues to burn without a wildfire exposure. The wildfire certainly initiates ignitions within the community, which is an important factor of the wildfire. The wildfire can, with burning embers, can expose and initiate ignitions in numerous simultaneous, overwhelming kinds of exposure. So let's take a look. This is somewhat ironic for me because this is the Angora fire, and you're looking at homes in the lower right corner in South Lake Tahoe. And interestingly enough, at least for me, in 2021, the Calder fire is actually crossing this area considerably to the south, to the far left, out of scene of this exact neighborhood. So the intense wildfire is spreading up Angora Creek at about 2:30 in the afternoon. And by the way, where the arrows are pointing down towards the community, that's where fire off of the flank of the intense wildfire spread on the surface through a fuel treatment to contact the first houses on the wildland side of the community that ignited and then spread fire throughout the community between 3:30 and 5 in the afternoon. So what do unconsumed vegetation and homes adjacent to total destruction indicate to us? It indicates that wildfire does not spread through the community like a lava flow, a flash flood, or a tsunami that explodes houses in flame, leaving total destruction in its wake. intense simultaneous heating across wide areas of structures does not occur. And this is an extremely important point in how it is that we homeowners have a huge amount of leverage in changing the conditions required for ignitions on our house very locally to our house. It's the local conditions that determine home ignitions. It's us, our authority, and as it turns out, matching responsibility that can readily change those conditions to eliminate home ignitions. So when we see a scene like this, total destruction does not indicate high intensity wildfire exposure. These homes ignited and freely burned to total destruction because there weren't firefighters available to extinguish small ignitions. It's not because they wouldn't, it was because they couldn't. They weren't available. In this particular case, we have several thousand houses exposed to a wildfire with on the order of initially about 100 responding engine units. So although initiated largely by burning embers from intense wildfires, burning residential fuels, the homes and the associated vegetation continue the fire spreading within the community. So now let's step back and look at how it is that it is the local conditions that determine the ignitions on our homes that we mostly care about. So when we look at an intense wildfire like this, it spreads because it meets the requirements for combustion. The fuel, heat, and oxygen insufficiency can then produce ignitions and sustain those ignitions. And thus fire occurs by meeting these requirements for combustion. And they meet right at the surface of the fuel. That means fire is a process. It's not a thing. And if we interrupt the process, then we don't have fire. And we can be quite assured that where post-fire we see it burned, indeed it met the requirements for combustion. And immediately adjacent to that, where it didn't burn, we know that the process halted for whatever reason. So wildfire spreads when ignition requirements are met at adjacent fuel during wildfires, including these extreme wildfires. So one step at a time, iterating time after time, even in conditions like this, it is a process. The requirements for combustion occur at the fuel surface. Fire is not a thing that travels from place to place like tsunamis, floods, and other natural hazards. It is not an earthquake. It is not something that moves from a disturbance out there that travels to here. It is a process. If that process can't continue, we don't have fire. And that provides us with opportunities to prevent wildland-urban fire disasters. That's how it is that we can look at big flames out there that aren't capable of igniting a fire over here and make those big flames that impress us completely ineffective as a natural hazard. Well, when we're talking about wildland-urban fire, when we're talking about communities initiating and burning during a wildland fire, it's not a wildfire problem. It's a home ignition problem. And because of that, now the fuel are the homes and the heat is all the burning materials, including burning embers, on and adjacent to the homes, and oxygen is always plentiful in this particular context. So now we want to look at our homes as potential fuel And when we want to do a fuel treatment, that means getting our homes ignition resistant. And what that also means is that geographic classifications, the term interface and intermix, do not determine home ignitions. It's a process. The home ignitions are occurring due to the conditions right at the surface of the fuel. It's not a relationship between where the community is and where the vegetation is. Of course, there's an association there, but the ignitions are not determined by that geographic association. The ignitions are determined by the requirements for combustion and the conditions that satisfy those requirements. And that's what we have control over, which is good news because it's not likely that we're going to start moving our suburban and exurban communities into the city center. So it's about the requirements for combustion, initiating communities burning, and therefore I call this the wildland-urban fire problem, not with an interface, not with the idea that somehow or another we can geographically classify and, more importantly, geographically solve this problem. So in this case, local conditions were not sufficient for ignition, where we have obviously high intensity burning surrounding this house, which the house did not meet the conditions required for combustion. And in this particular case, we see largely no intense burning, no tree canopy involved, and we see total destruction of the house. So that raises the question of how far is local and what conditions principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. So this is where a great deal of the research that I did comes into play. And the results of the modeling that I did, the physical modeling, the experiments, both laboratory as well as field experiments, and the examinations of post-fire as well as during fire examinations of the wildland-urban fire situation. That's what I did, and the characteristics that I found, the results of that research indicated that the characteristics of a home in relation to burning materials in the immediate surroundings within just 100 feet principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. Well, so let me clarify. That 100 feet is looking at flames. It's looking at the flame front. It's looking at this idea that if we've got big flames that are further away than 100 feet from the house, we can't meet the requirements for combustion on the wood of that house. And when I was doing this research, particularly the modeling and the experiments, the resulting 100 feet was an intended overestimate. I don't want to underestimate the bridge load. I don't want to underestimate that distance. Now I'm scaling essentially where we're going to do our ignition resistance work. Well, so how can 100 feet be an overestimate? Well, how would we know? Because our perceptions of fire are through what affects us. And as it turns out, our human skin sensitivity to thermal pain and injury is much greater than the heating requirements for piloted wood ignition. That is, that's an ignition where I start heating up the wood, it decomposes to produce flammable vapors. Those flammable vapors mix with the oxygen in the air. And then with a small spark or small flame, I can ignite that flammable mixture. Well, so let's get an idea about what causes us pain and injury compared to what it takes in order to ignite wood. For example, a flame radiative exposure that produces a second-degree burn on my exposed skin in 5 seconds takes over 27 minutes to ignite a wood wall. Well, 27 minutes is a huge amount of time for a fire burning, particularly a wildfire of high intensity burning at a single location, which only takes on the order of less than a minute at a particular location, which means that if it doesn't continue to ignite something adjacent to those big flames, then it goes out. And that means that our human perception of ignition requirements is not reliable for judging the ignitability of our home. So I'm going to give an example here that's related to flames, not burning embers. We'll get to burning embers in a moment. So here I am on an incident in Southern California. I was talking with the strike team leader of an engine crew, of an engine strike team, and his comment was, well, when this area to the left started to burn intensely, we had to disengage because of life safety. And by the way, the area to the left of the fellow on the street was Manzanita, and it burned to ground level. So it produced high intensities, indeed, high intensities. People can't be there between the high intensity fire and the community. We see an aerial view, and in our examination, we found that the house, the destroyed structure, was more than 100 feet from the most intense, the largest flames that occurred. And there was a surviving wood fence, a split rail fence that we'll see in a moment, that was about 45 feet from that location. And when we look closer at this surviving fence, we don't even see any thermal degradation, no char. We see scorched leaves, but the scorched leaves occur from the same exposure, the same sensitivity as what produces a second-degree burn on our exposed skin. So interestingly enough, the flames could not have ignited that house. Indeed, it was a life safety issue, an injury issue, but it wasn't an ignition issue. So we have the opportunity to reduce fuels within 100 feet of a home, to discontinue intense fire spread, to prevent ignitions from intense radiant heating, and prevent surface fire flames from contacting the home, potentially to ignite it, without necessarily controlling the wildfire. It's clear that we didn't control the wildfire around this surviving house. So home ignitions during extreme wildfires are principally determined by the ignition characteristics of a home in relation to the burning objects within 100 feet of the home. And this has come to be known as the home ignition zone. Here's an example. It's not a model for, we don't necessarily require everybody's home to look like this, but the effect has to be the same. So what's the effect? Well, so we have intense crown fire spreading across this slope, and we had insufficient flame heating and a home that was ignition resistant from burning embers, such that it's sustained. It didn't ignite sustainably. Well, but typically extreme wildfires don't spread into developed neighborhoods. So when we look at this situation, we see there was an intense crown fire. This was on June 18th, by the way, of 2002, in an area that is generally called Heber Overgaard in Arizona. The houses on the right side of the residential street were essentially inside the crown fire. But interestingly enough, 40 feet from canopy to canopy across this street could not ignite the tree canopies. And yet for another 2.5 blocks to the state highway, there was total destruction without crown fire. Why? There was a blizzard of burning embers coming out of this crown fire, starting at a distance and then increasing to the edge. So this is what I'm talking about. This kind of close range burning ember exposure. And here we're on the Woolsey fire, with a couple of guys on a deck, and it is absolute chaos with burning embers. But note, perhaps I need to go back, they are not mortally threatened by burning embers. And so as a result, we tend to, as people, we tend to pay attention to the things that cause us pain and injury. And granted, burning embers are not a wonderful experience, but we don't perceive burning embers as a mortal threat to us. We tend to focus on the big flames. Burning embers are inevitable during extreme wildfires, and burning embers come beyond the home ignition zone, that 100 feet from the house. Embers commonly ignite structures and vegetation within communities at distances of a half mile or more during extreme wildfire conditions. And this, of course, varies depending on the type of vegetation. If it's large woody vegetation with flammable canopies, it's going to produce high velocity flames that strip off burning material and cast it in severe winds downwind to ignite burning ember fires, spot fires. So, but regardless of the distance lofted from the wildfire, burning embers only generate home ignitions at locations of accumulation. It doesn't get any more local than burning embers directly on the home, on debris that is deposited on the home. So let's take a look at demonstrations that I was involved in. I was a collaborator with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, where we did demonstrations and experiments using burning ember generators on a home. So here's our full-size home inside our research center. We have pine needles in the rain gutters that are plastic PVC gutters. We have aluminum gutters and another PVC length. We have pine needle debris in the roof valley of a fiberglass asphalt composition shingle covered roof, pine needle mulch at the front, bark mulch on the side, vinyl siding, fiber cement, composition board, fiber composition board. Here we have the demonstration. We have a ember exposure. This is a representation of the intensity that you can have from close range burning ember exposures. And notice, without any flame exposure on this house, we've got flame contact on the structure due to the very close proximity of debris, flammable debris, pine needles at the base, immediately beginning, initially igniting and contacting the structure. We've got fire starting in the gutters, and we get fire in the valley debris of the home. This is real time. This isn't, what we're looking at here is an area where we, the homeowners, have sole authority over having it or not having it. We have flame contact on this structure due to the debris, not due to big flames. Note that we have the plastic gutters falling out onto the surface. Now, interestingly enough, it's the burning on the left side of the house in that re-entrant corner that becomes the sustained ignition on this house, not on the composition shingle roof. And we ended up suppressing this because our goal here is not to burn houses down inside the facility. It's to look at how ignitions can occur due to debris and a intense burning ember exposure. Well, so residential fuels, the burning structures and adjacent vegetation, once it begins within a community, the burning structures and adjacent vegetation become significant sources of embers that continue community fire spread hours after significant wildfire exposures. So this is the last day in Southern California during the Cedar Fire, 2003. In the early morning, this ember exposure is from 2 houses burning. And it gives us an idea the kind of ember exposure that can be experienced without a wildfire. So wildland urban fire disasters do not occur from a tsunami of flames sweeping through the community. Houses don't literally explode in flames. It indeed is not a war zone. And dragons from hell aren't to blame. So how do wildland urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's start with severe fire conditions. Strong winds, low relative humidity, sufficient fuels to produce severe intensities, extreme intensities that overwhelm fire suppression, and of course the topographic effects. Then we get an ignition. So given an ignition under those conditions, or having an ignition and then those conditions developing, we end up with extreme fire behavior, rapid fire spread, and or high intensities. Then, given that we have development, we've got a community that can be exposed, we end up, that is vulnerable to ignition. We have multiple simultaneous ignitions that overwhelm our fire protection resources. We've already not been able to suppress the wildfire to prevent the exposure within the community. And now we have multiple initiation of ignitions within the community that overwhelms our fire protection, which means that there are many homes that have ignited and are burning without any fire protection available for suppression. And we have multiple free burning houses to total destruction. The disaster occurs. So wildland urban fire disasters have only occurred during extreme wildfire conditions when wildfire suppression was ineffective and structure fire protection was overwhelmed. Again, it's not that we wouldn't protect the houses, it's we couldn't protect the houses because of the overwhelming exposure and burning. Well, so what's our current approach to preventing wildland urban fire disasters? These are the tools of wildfire suppression. And this fails to prevent wildland urban fire disasters during extreme wildland urban fire conditions. When the conditions become extreme, escaping our initial attack, rapidly spreading with high intensities, this fails. The inevitability of extreme wildfire conditions and our inability to control extreme wildfires suggests inevitable wildland urban fire disasters. However, the home ignition zone ignition conditions primarily determine home ignitions during the extreme wildfires. That area of the home in relation to its immediate surroundings within roughly 100 feet determines the conditions for home ignition. That's where we do our fuel treatment in order to keep the homes from burning. So total destruction commonly starts with small ember ignitions on and adjacent to the home that can be readily prevented. So when we go back to the disaster sequence, what we're going to look at here is the extreme wildfire, but now we have eliminated the home ignitions, or more realistically, we have eliminated many of the ignition vulnerabilities, thus eliminating many of the potential ignitions or ignitions. And then those that do occur, because we can't fireproof our houses, the houses we live in, by and large, we can't fireproof them, but we can make it such that the tactical task of protecting the community then comes into parity with the number of fires that occur that we have to extinguish. And so we're not overwhelmed in our protection. Many homes are now protected, many more than would be protected otherwise, and we prevent the disaster. So the prevention of the wildland-urban fire disaster is not about controlling extreme wildfire, which we can't do. It's about a much smaller task and much more readily available task of reducing home ignition. We can make homes and communities ignition resistant by eliminating and reducing ignition factors within the home ignition zone. Wildland-urban fire is a home ignition problem, not a problem of controlling extreme wildfire. We can make homes ignition resistant during extreme wildfires by eliminating ignitions from flames within the home ignition zone and reducing ember ignitions of the home. So remember, home ignitions during extreme wildfires are a local combustion process determined by local conditions within the home ignition zone. It's not an interface, an intermix, or other geographic classification. And home ignition resistant homes do not have flammable debris on the home and its flammable attachments. They do not have any ignitable material within 5 feet of the home and its flammable attachments. There is no flame contact from within the home ignition zone. We can easily eliminate high intensity burning within the home ignition zone, and burning embers become the only ignition mechanism of wildfire home exposure. So what about building codes? Well, we need to be careful when we think about building codes, because our current building codes, now granted, we've got California 7A, and I won't get into, well, primarily because I haven't been involved in 7A for many years, but we need to be careful that the codes actually are appropriate and effective for the context, for the conditions of the wildfire exposure. And commonly our fire codes designate fire performance rather than ignition performance. So the materials and designs of a fire performance code slow flame spread with their ratings, such as extended time wall, ceiling, and door fire penetration hour ratings. And many of our fire codes assume that we're going to have protection. And those codes won't help prevent wildland-urban fire disasters. So fire performance codes that facilitate fire control by reducing interior fire involvement rates assume a firefighter response. But remember, during the wildland-urban fire with multiple many homes simultaneously having an initiation of ignition, having a simultaneous exposure over large areas, we have reduced fire protection capability. So those homes that are vulnerable require mitigation of the things that ignite the vulnerabilities that occur related to a wildfire exposure, not related necessarily to our common fire coding. So without protection from firefighters or residents, any sustained ignition results in a total destruction. Home ignition resistance during extreme wildfires increases ignition performance and eliminates most ignitions. So we need codes appropriate for wildland-urban, so that wildland-urban fire can be beneficially mitigated. So how do we code pine needles in gutters, firewood on the deck, and flammable material under the deck? So let's take a look at an example where codes might be highly effective with regard to wildland-urban fire. That is the urban conflagration in high-density development that happens to initiate from a wildfire. So now we're talking about structure-to-structure ignitions where we have very small clearance from structure to structure. In this particular case, I'm using Coffey Park as an example, where we have very high density, we have very minimal property line setbacks between houses. And in this particular case, we can potentially code not only for wildfire, but also for any fire occurrence that might occur in a neighborhood like this. We can begin to, from a materials and design standpoint, have non-flammable materials covering the house, certainly between structures, from structure to structure, such as common materials like fiber cement siding, facing board, trim boards, and boxing panels. This is a situation of extreme overlapping home ignition zones where the physics of ignition doesn't change, but certainly the social dynamics becomes critical. Without having a cooperative community, and by the way, codes and regulations tend to mandate that social dynamic that is responsible for your neighbor, they become critical. So making our homes ignition resistant means having wildfires without wildland-urban fire disasters. Thank you.